As paramedics and aid workers come under attack, we ask the UN's humanitarian chief, Tom Fletcher, about the importance of calling out those responsible.
We've lost over 1,000 humanitarians globally in just the last 3 years. That's a trebling of the number of my colleagues who are being killed by these attacks.
But the question specifically is about who the perpetrators are, Mr. Fletcher, because how do you achieve accountability if we're not able to name them?
Of those 1,000 humanitarians who've been killed over the last 3 years, over half of them have been killed in Gaza. So a large number of those have been killed by Israel.
Hello, I'm Rida Fakhri. Welcome to the program. A fifth of the population displaced, key infrastructure destroyed, and threats by Israel to repeat the destruction of whole communities that we've seen in Gaza. That was what Tom Fletcher called the grim picture in Lebanon, where he once served as British ambassador and one he's seen for himself. The UN Under-Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs says he's been horrified by attacks on humanitarian workers there, part of a lethal pattern he recently outlined to the Security Council.
These deaths are not because we are reckless with our lives. They are because parties to the conflict are reckless with our lives. So, on behalf of over 1,000 dead humanitarians and their families, we ask why. Is it because it is more important to protect those designing, selling, supplying, and firing lethal weapons, including drones, cyber tools, artificial intelligence, than protecting us?
Since taking up his position in 2024, Tom Fletcher has traveled extensively to Sudan, Gaza, and more recently, Lebanon. He joins us now. Under-Secretary General, you've been warning about the humanitarian situation in Lebanon. In fact, you said that Lebanon was at, quote, breaking point. What made you reach this bleak assessment, and who do you hold responsible for the current situation?
Well, I think we always have to be careful, particularly with Lebanon, about throwing phrases like breaking point around. People have said to me for so many years, things are at breaking point. You know, it's a moment to midnight. I felt that because I visited. I spent 2 or 3 days there, and because I was ambassador in Lebanon, I've got a sense of an antennae for how things really are. And I felt the levels of tension, the levels of destruction and displacement have really placed so much pressure. And of course, this comes after years of difficulties, including the port explosion, the economic collapse. And so I really worry that too much pressure is being placed on Lebanon right now. 1 in 5 people is a refugee. And so we need everyone to step back. We need Israel to restrain itself. We need Hezbollah to stop firing the rockets indiscriminately into northern Israel. We need to give space for dialogue and consensus.
So you are asking both sides to essentially de-escalate. And we often hear very generic statements from the UN leadership about all sides. But doesn't it risk creating a false equivalence between the side that is committing violations and the side that is perhaps suffering those violations?
Look, I'm the emergency guy for the UN, so my job is to go where the hardship is, where the humanitarian numbers are highest. And clearly, there are many more humanitarian casualties on the Lebanese side than on the Israeli side. But I care about that humanitarian impact across both countries and, of course, beyond. But the majority of our humanitarian operations here are obviously in South Lebanon, southern Beirut, and across Lebanon, where the humanitarian caseload is highest.
But would you say that violations are not all equal in nature and in scale? Because we've seen repeated, and many people on the ground would say deliberate, targeting and killing of paramedics, of humanitarian workers, of UN peacekeepers, of journalists by one side, and that is Israel.
Look, we want it all to stop, but clearly, you're right, the scale is much greater from Israel towards Lebanon. More civilians are suffering in Lebanon right now than in Israel. But we want to see an end to the escalation by Hezbollah and by the Israeli Defense Forces. We want to see a return to sanity and reason and dialogue. And I think there is an opening right now for dialogue between Lebanon and Israel, and it has to be seized.
You say it has to be seized, but we've seen in the past how Israel has continued to violate its ceasefire. In fact, according to the United Nations itself, over 15,000 violations of Lebanese sovereignty since the November 2024 ceasefire was achieved. These are violations by Israel. What makes you feel hopeful that this will be any different?
Well, I have to confess they're not being hugely hopeful, but I think we have to grab any opportunity we get to change that dynamic. And I think what's new is you've got this offer from the Lebanese government, from President Al, and I met him a couple of weeks ago in Beirut, from the Prime Minister, from across the leadership, to have this dialogue. And that is a historical change in the posture of the Lebanese state. So there's an opening there, but we've got to end this violence. You know, I met many of those humanitarians who are under fire in Lebanon right now. I met many of the medical workers, the ambulance drivers, those going out whose vehicles have been attacked while they are saving lives in southern Lebanon.
Attacked by whom?
For their sake, they've got to be protected.
Attacked by whom?
Attacked by Israel. I mean, that's clear.
So isn't it important to name
have
names?
The protection of international law and of the international community. And I've challenged member states, I've challenged the UN Security Council to give them that protection.
And you have called them war crimes. Indeed, they are war crimes under international law. Why is it that we still see no consequences, just statements of concern?
Well, I think that's a question for the international community, for the member states. I've been very clear, including with the Security Council, that targeting health workers anywhere in the world is a breach of international law. This is not lawful activity, evidently. Just read the international humanitarian law. It's not me making this stuff up on the spot. This is international humanitarian law. Do not attack civilians. Do not attack civilian infrastructure. Do not attack humanitarians. Do not attack health workers, whether that's in northern Israel or southern Lebanon or Iran or Sudan or Ukraine, anywhere where we're dealing with these crises and conflicts. You know, we've lost over 1,000 humanitarians globally in just the last 3 years. That's a trebling of the number of my colleagues who are being killed by these attacks, many of them by much more sophisticated weaponry, by drones in particular. So the world is using its creativity and ingenuity against civilians and against humanitarians.
No, but the question specifically is about who the perpetrators are, Mr. Fletcher, because how do you achieve accountability if we're not able to name them?
Of those 1,000 humanitarians who've been killed over the last 3 years, over half of them have been killed in Gaza. So a large number of those have been killed by Israel. The next biggest place where people are being killed is Sudan. Now, they've been killed by both SAF and by RSF, but it's not my job I'm not the international lawyer who comes into you and says, let me tell you who's killing who. I'm the humanitarian guy. It's like I'm the fire service, the ambulance service. And it's my job to mobilize that humanitarian response to go and help the survivors of these attacks. It's for the member states and the international community to come on and tell you whose fault it is and how they'll stop that happening.
In your recent comments to the UN Security Council from Beirut, you said a cycle of coercive displacement is unfolding. Why do you call it displacement when it is the forced expulsion of an entire community, a Shia community of hundreds of thousands of people? UN experts released a statement recently saying it points to ethnic cleansing. Would you agree with them?
So we're really worried. We call it coercive displacement. That's the strongest language that I've been using for it. 1 in 5 people right now in Lebanon is displaced. As I went into Syria a couple of weeks ago, 200,000 people had passed into Syria from Lebanon in just a month. So I'm horrified that there are villages being destroyed in the south of Lebanon, making that area uninhabitable for huge communities who've lived there for decades, for centuries. And of course, that's completely unacceptable.
But beyond being unacceptable, would you say it is ethnic cleansing?
I'm not going to play the game of take those questions to the Security Council.
Would you go as far as calling it ethnic cleansing because it is the Shia community that's targeted?
No, I'm not going to go that far.
So you disagree then with the UN experts who say that it points
That's
toward
not the language that I use for this situation. I've been talking about coercive displacement. It's for the Security Council, it's for the member states to work to hold people to account for doing this. My job is to run the humanitarian response and try and help the survivors.
How can you help survivors on a humanitarian level, those million Lebanese people, 1.1 million, who have been now internally displaced? Where do they go?
This is a massive concern. And I talked a lot to the Lebanese leadership across the different communities about this, because we know from previous cycles of violence, the political strains that places Lebanon under. We're already dealing with many communities that have been displaced many, many times. into Syria, back from Syria now, and of course from the south of Lebanon. So it's a major concern. I visited City Sportif, where many of those who've been displaced are being looked after now. But then, of course, just 2 days after I left, that area was also placed under a displacement order. So it's a horrific situation for these families and communities, and it's not evident where they can go safely.
And this is all happening at a time when Lebanon itself is going through an economic financial crisis. But on the political military front, Mr. Fletcher, Israel has said that it will continue to push ahead with its invasion of Lebanon. And it has said that it will not allow the Lebanese of the south to return to their homes. How do you stop this? You've talked about a culture of lawlessness and impunity. How do you stop it?
Well, I can't. I'm afraid I can't stop it. I can try to call it out. I can go to the Security Council and brief them on the situation. I can try and run the most effective humanitarian response possible. I can appeal to member states to be more generous in their funding of that response. I can ask them, implore them to be stronger in holding the parties to account and ending this conflict. But unfortunately, the UN doesn't have the sticks and the carrots to stop the conflict. All we can do is to keep sharing the evidence, sharing the information with the world, and insisting that international law is respected.
And will international law ever be respected in the case of Lebanon?
At the moment, international law is being disrespected in so many of the places that I work. I mean, and I try and call this out in the Security Council all the time. I don't see it being respected in the case of Lebanon right now. I don't see it being respected in so many conflicts. I've been at the Sudan conference here in Berlin, and there's a culture of impunity across so much of the work that we are doing right now. And I hear member states call for respect for international law in general terms, call for accountability in general terms, but where are the investigations after attacks on civilians? Where are the investigations after attacks on humanitarians? Where is the strenuous effort to stop these weapon supplies reaching the people who are killing us in such numbers?
You talk about investigations. There are credible reports that Israel has been shelling towns and civilian areas in South Lebanon with white phosphorus in violation of international humanitarian law. Has the UN done anything to investigate this?
Well, we're struggling to get our people into the south right now because of the access being blocked. 5 of those 6 bridges to the south, we can't actually cross at the moment, and we're having many convoys turn back. But of course, it's for the investigators to properly investigate it. You've got me on as the emergency humanitarian guy. My job is to save as many survivors as we can.
Human Rights Watch verified these reports. What needs to happen?
So we've got to have full investigations. And of course, using white phosphorus against civilians would clearly be a massive breach of international law. So we need the investigations. We need to find out the truth, and then there needs to be accountability for whatever has happened.
Should there be sanctions against Israel and the Israeli military for the crimes, and you've called them war crimes, for the war crimes that are taking place in Lebanon and in Gaza?
I've said that targeting international humanitarians, targeting any humanitarians, targeting civilians is, of course, a war crime. Targeting health workers is a war crime. There has to be accountability for any breach of international law in Sudan, in Lebanon, in Gaza, everywhere we work. But it's for the member states. It's not for me to then basically work. I'm not the lawyer here. I'm not the person whose job it is to be prosecuting people for war crimes. My job is to deliver humanitarian help to the survivors and the victims.
What concrete action beyond statements can the UN take to challenge this culture of impunity?
We can keep asking the member states to do their job and to hold people to account and to stand up for international humanitarian law. And then for us, the humanitarians, we can keep saving as many lives as we can in a world where we are underfunded, we're overstretched, we're literally being killed in our hundreds doing this work, but we keep going out towards the danger in order to respond. We're doing that right now in the DRC, in Ukraine, in Lebanon, in Sudan, across all of these crises. Right now, humanitarians are at the checkpoints, pushing their way through to reach the survivors.
You've been very outspoken, and there is so much you can do. But do you agree with some of the criticism that has been leveled at the UN leadership, the Secretary General, for not speaking up enough, for not using his moral authority to ask for real consequences and to hold Israel to the same standards as everyone else, which is something you said needs to happen?
No, I don't agree with that at all. I see the statements that the SG puts out every day. I talk to him about those statements. I see the statements that his spokesperson puts out at the noon briefing every day. He's taken a very strong position, principled position through this escalation across the Middle East in the last month, on the situation in Gaza over the last few years, on the situation in Lebanon. He was there himself, as was I, a couple of weeks ago, repeating those statements. So his public position has been incredibly firm and robust. The problem we're having is that the international community isn't coming behind that and actually enforcing international law in the way it should.
But there is a certain moral authority that the Secretary General of the United Nations can wield. And he has, for the most part, talked about both sides and asked all sides to de-escalate. In the case of Iran, you had a war of aggression. In the case of Gaza, UN experts have said it was a genocide. In the case of Lebanon, you've got an invasion that is going on. Doesn't this warrant more than just general statements calling on all sides to de-escalate?
I think, I saw his last statement on the Middle East. He was very clear in saying he wants Israel and the US to cease the attacks. He was also very clear that he wants Iran to cease its attacks across the Gulf against neighbors. On Lebanon, he's been very clear that Hezbollah should stop the indiscriminate rocket fire. He's been very clear that Israel should stop the attacks on South Lebanon and South Beirut and should cease this escalation. So I hear him every day being very firm and in explicitly calling on the different parties to stop this violence. So I don't hear any lack of force in what he's saying.
Well, there is a lack of force when you consider the number of UN peacekeepers and UN personnel who've come under direct attack by the Israeli military, both in Lebanon and in Gaza. Are you surprised that the world isn't doing anything, that it is standing by and allowing these attacks to happen, allowing attacks by a UN member state on civilian areas? Just on the day that Iran announced the ceasefire agreement with the United States, Israel attacked 100 targets in Lebanon in just a span of 10 minutes.
And I heard the world speak out very firmly. I was at the Security Council when member states were really unequivocal in saying that had to stop and calling it out. So I do hear those voices, but I don't see the pressure that's actually taking effect in bringing Israel away from that action and bringing the warring parties in Sudan away from the actions they're taking in stopping the Russia-Ukraine war. There are so many conflicts right now where we're hearing the statements, but we're not seeing the action.
Why aren't we seeing any action in the case of Israel? Why are we seeing no consequence, no sanctions?
I think you'd have to ask the member states. It's not for me to impose sanctions. It's for individual member states to decide what they think is necessary and how they can bring pressure.
As long as there are no consequences of this nature, will we continue to see the cycle?
I fear we will. And I think we're in this more transactional moment, this moment when the world is pulling apart and when the systems, the institutions, the laws, the norms, the principles which are meant to protect civilians from this kind of harm, from this kind of escalation, from the use of deadly weaponry against civilians and against humanitarians. We're seeing all of that coming under sustained attack right now. And we're not seeing enough people stand up and explaining why it matters. These rules, we're not perfect as the UN, but these rules were created in response to a time when we'd seen the world pull apart. We'd seen the consequences of that in the Second World War. And our predecessors were trying to create something better, to create the brakes on us, the restraint on us, to protect civilians. And it's that we're seeing not just eroded, but attacked day by day.
You warned that Lebanon could become another Gaza. What led you to this conclusion? And why hasn't the international system acted preemptively when the intentions of the Israeli government were clear?
So my big concern in making that statement, it was a response to comments I'd seen from Israeli cabinet ministers, where they talked about doing to Lebanon what they did to Gaza. And I've been to Gaza twice in the last year. I've seen the devastation there, and it's a chilling statement to hear. And I felt it was necessary to call that out and to really insist that people put the protections in place, the restraint in place, the pressure in place to prevent that happening.
Just how close are we? Are we weeks, months away from this scenario?
I don't know. I mean, I think I felt very depressed when I was in Beirut. I know Lebanon well. I talked to lots of people there, and felt the levels of tension and anxiety, really high levels. People feeling that pressure, the constant whir of the drones, the constant sense that the next attack is coming. So I'm deeply worried about the direction there. But I don't have a crystal ball. I can't forecast what will happen next. But whatever happens, we'll be there responding and trying to save as many lives as we can.
But are you able to deliver on your job when this constant fear exists?
It makes it much harder. The lack of funding makes it much harder. The fact that people are killing us in such high numbers across all of the areas we work really makes it much, much harder. But we carry on going out there. We saved 7 million lives in January, and we're hoping to save 87 million lives this year. Now, that's the starting point. To do that, we're trying to raise $23 billion. That's less than 1% of what the world will spend on guns and arms this year. It's less than was spent on this entire Middle East conflict in just the last month. And with that, we can save 87 million lives. Now, that's just a start, because we should be reaching over 300 million people with life-saving support.
But is the UN today able to still shape events, or has it become, to a large extent, an irrelevant player when it comes to stopping these wars and these conflicts?
I don't believe irrelevant at all. And I'm at the Sudan conference in Berlin, and we've been working flat out to try to get agreements in place that can reduce the scale of that conflict, try and move us towards humanitarian truces, humanitarian ceasefires, and ultimately to some sort of peace deal that can help us respond to the world's largest humanitarian disaster. 34 million people, 2/3 of Sudanese people need support right now. We've saved 2 million lives already this year in Sudan. So I don't think that's irrelevant at all.
Why isn't the humanitarian situation in Sudan getting as much attention as it should?
The media are much more focused on the Middle East. So the huge attention tends to go there. I think, it's not just Sudan, it's South Sudan is very neglected as a crisis. The DRC, enormous numbers in need right now in so many of these conflict zones. Myanmar is another one that often gets neglected. Somalia, where I'm going in a couple of weeks, hugely neglected. I think the media has a very short attention span, so runs after the kind of highest profile crisis of the moment.
And there's, of course, the ongoing situation in Iran, which hasn't been entirely resolved yet. You've announced $12 million in aid. How hopeful are you that the situation in Iran will not result in more of a humanitarian crisis than it already has?
So you've got the implications inside Iran, where, as you say, we're scaling up that response with that 12 million contribution. We've got agencies on the ground, teams on the ground, assessing whether there's more that we should be doing to respond to the needs of the Iranian people who've been under such attack. Then you've got the already displaced populations in Iran, but of course across neighbors as well, through Afghanistan, Pakistan, enormous people already on the move. And we're watching very carefully to make sure that we're getting the right support to them. You've got the implications, we've discussed Lebanon, the implications for places like Gaza, where throughout that conflict, our access to Gaza was restricted. That one crossing that was open, but we were getting even fewer trucks in each day. So our ability to save lives there was restricted. And then you have the knock-on effect, the knock-on implications across the region, where the price of food, the price of fertilizer, the price of natural gas is going up 15, 20%. And that will have the effect of bringing more people into poverty, into economic insecurity, into starvation. And so the numbers that we're trying to reach will increase while our costs will go up. And then there's an extra implication of all this, which is that the world retreats further from protection of international law, that we're moving further towards this lawless world.
Can we even talk about international law? Many people say that it simply doesn't exist when it comes to weaker countries defending themselves against the violations by more powerful countries and their allies.
It's under attack. It's under sustained attack. We as the UN will not retreat from defending international humanitarian law. The humanitarian community will not retreat from international law. We have to be out there explaining what it is to people who don't necessarily seem to understand that, and also explaining why it matters so much, how it was developed, and why it is so important to the future of coexistence on this planet.
Tom Fletcher, Under-Secretary General for the United Nations, Humanitarian Affairs, thank you so much.
Many thanks, Gita.
What Tom Fletcher ultimately lays bare is a system that allows violations of humanitarian law to persist with little consequence. From Gaza to Lebanon to Sudan, the pattern is familiar: escalating violence, mass displacement, and an aid architecture stretched to breaking point, while key actors shield themselves and their allies from scrutiny. It will take more than statements of concern and outrage to hold the powerful accountable, and for the United Nations to restore some of its lost relevance and credibility. That's all from me, Rida Fakhri, and the entire team. Thanks for watching.